Imagine standing on the deck of a warship, surrounded by nearly 1,000 vessels, the sea so packed with hulls that you could almost walk from one ship to another. The year is 1279. The fate of an entire civilization, one of the oldest and most sophisticated on Earth, hangs in the balance. On one side, a dynasty that has ruled China for over 3 centuries, now reduced to a child emperor and a handful of desperate loyalists. On the other side, the most terrifying military machine the medieval world has ever produced, the Mongols, the conquerors of half the known world, now commanding a fleet that darkens the horizon. What you are about to witness is not merely a battle. It is the death of a civilization, the drowning of an empire, and one of the most devastating naval defeats in all of human history. This is the Battle of Yamen, and almost nobody in the Western world has ever heard of it. Before we go any further, let me give you a number. 100,000. That is the number of people who died in the waters off the coast of what is now southern China on a single day in March of 1279. 100,000 people. To put that in perspective, the Battle of Trafalgar, which the British celebrate as the greatest naval battle in their history, resulted in roughly 7,000 casualties on both sides combined. The Battle of Midway, which changed the course of the Second World War in the Pacific, resulted in around 3,000 deaths. The Battle of Yamen killed more people in a single engagement than most nations lost in entire wars, and yet it sits almost invisible in Western historical memory, buried under centuries of silence. So why does this matter to you today? Because this battle did not just end a dynasty, it ended an era. It closed the door on a golden age of Chinese civilization that was so advanced, so sophisticated, so extraordinarily developed, that historians are still trying to fully understand what was lost when those waters swallowed the last Song emperor. Paper money, advanced maritime technology, mechanical clocks, gunpowder weapons far ahead of anything in Europe, a civil service examination system that selected leaders on merit rather than birth. All of this was the inheritance of the Southern Song dynasty. And when the last Song ship sank at Yamen, something irreplaceable went with it beneath the waves. To truly understand what happened at Yamen, we need to go back. We need to go back to the very beginning to understand what the Song dynasty was, what made it remarkable, and why it found itself in this impossible situation, surrounded on the sea, with nowhere left to run. The Song dynasty came to power in 960, founded by a military general named Zhao Quanjian, who would reign as Emperor Taizu. China at this time was fragmented, divided among competing warlords and kingdoms following the collapse of the Tang dynasty. Taizu reunified much of China through a combination of military campaigning and extraordinary political skill. He did something that very few successful generals in Chinese history had managed before him. He voluntarily demilitarized the political system. He understood that the chaos of the preceding decades had come from soldiers with too much power, and he systematically shifted authority away from the military and toward civilian administrators. This was a brilliant long-term policy for political stability. But it would, centuries later, contribute to the dynasty's inability to defend itself. The Song dynasty that emerged from Taizu's founding was something genuinely remarkable. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Song period represents one of the great flowerings of human civilization. Historians sometimes call it China's Renaissance, though this comparison can be misleading, because in many ways Song China was far ahead of what Renaissance Europe would later achieve. The capital city of Hangzhou, during the Southern Song period, was almost certainly the largest city in the world, with a population that may have reached 1.5 million people at its peak. Marco Polo, who visited China during the subsequent Mongol Yuan dynasty, was so overwhelmed by Hangzhou that he described it as the greatest city in the world, a place of such beauty and sophistication that he feared his own countrymen back in Venice would not believe him. What was happening economically in Song China was extraordinary. This was the period when China developed the world's first paper currency, a revolutionary financial innovation that required sophisticated banking institutions, trust systems, and economic thinking far ahead of anything happening in the medieval West. The Song government was printing paper money and managing currency supply at a time when European merchants were still largely dependent on coins and barter. Commerce flourished to a degree unprecedented in Chinese history. The merchant class, traditionally looked down upon in Confucian society, grew wealthy and influential. Maritime trade expanded enormously, with Chinese ships sailing to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa. And those ships, we need to talk about those ships, because the vessels that Chinese shipbuilders were producing during the Song period were among the most sophisticated watercraft in the world. Chinese naval architects had developed the magnetic compass, which they were using for maritime navigation well before European sailors had any idea such a tool existed. They had developed watertight compartments within ships' hulls, a technology that made vessels far safer and more survivable, a technology that would not be independently developed in the West until the 18th century, when a British naval architect named Mark Boeuf proposed it and was dismissed as a crank until it was proven to work. Chinese shipbuilders were also using multiple masts and sophisticated rigging systems, building ships of a scale that dwarfed anything being produced in Europe at the time. The intellectual life of Song China was equally extraordinary. This was the period of Neo-Confucianism, a sophisticated philosophical movement that attempted to synthesize Confucian ethics with Buddhist and Taoist insights about the nature of reality. Scholars like Zhu Zai produced works of philosophical complexity and depth that would influence East Asian thought for centuries. Chinese mathematics was advancing rapidly, with scholars working on problems in algebra and numerical methods that would not be tackled in Europe for several more centuries. The development of movable type printing, attributed to a craftsman named Bai Sheng around 1040, meant that books could be produced more quickly and cheaply than ever before, accelerating the spread of literacy and knowledge. Poetry flourished. Painting reached extraordinary heights of refinement with artists like Su Dongpo, who was also a poet and essayist, a government official, and a food enthusiast, exemplifying the ideal of the cultivated scholar gentleman. The famous Song landscape paintings, with their misty mountains and philosophical depth, represent one of the great artistic traditions in human history. Ceramics production reached peaks of technical perfection in forms like Guanware and Ruware, the latter so rare and so prized that even a single surviving piece today commands tens of millions of dollars at auction. But there was a shadow over all of this brilliance. From the very beginning, the Song dynasty struggled with military threats from its northern neighbors. The dynasty had never fully reunified all of historical China. The northern territories remained under the control of successive non-Chinese dynasties, first the Liao, then the Jurchen Jin dynasty. The Song had lost the ancient northern heartland of Chinese civilization, including the old capitals of Luoyang and Kaifeng, to these northern invaders. The dynasty's center of gravity had shifted south, to the Yangtze River Valley and beyond, which is why we call the later phase of the dynasty the Southern Song. This geographical situation had profound consequences. The Song court, relocated to Hangzhou in the south, governed from a position of permanent strategic vulnerability. The loss of the northern plains, which had historically been China's primary zone of horse raising, meant that the Song military was chronically short of cavalry. And in the military thinking of medieval Eurasia, cavalry was the dominant offensive arm. The Song were therefore forced to invest heavily in defensive warfare, fortifications, waterways, naval power, rather than the kind of aggressive offensive campaigns that might have pushed the northern threats back permanently. There is a great debate among historians about whether this military weakness was an inherent flaw in the Song system or simply an unfortunate circumstance that any dynasty might have faced given the geopolitical pressures of the time. The demilitarization policy of the founding emperor, which had been so successful in preventing internal fragmentation, had created a culture that valued civilian scholarship over military prowess. Song officials were frequently contemptuous of soldiers, and the military profession carried relatively low social status compared to what it enjoyed in the Jin dynasty or later among the Mongols. This cultural attitude made it harder to attract talented leadership into the military and harder to sustain the kind of aggressive, expansionist military culture that might have provided better defense. Despite these structural challenges, the Southern Song survived for over a century and a half after losing the North. This was no small achievement. The dynasty used every tool available: diplomacy, tribute payments, defensive fortifications of extraordinary sophistication, and increasingly its naval power to maintain itself against constant pressure from the north. The Song Navy in particular became one of the great military instruments of its age. Unable to match northern armies on land, the Song poured resources into maritime and riverine warfare. They developed gunpowder weapons for naval use, including fire arrows, bombs, and early versions of what we might recognize as firearms. They built enormous warships capable of carrying these weapons into battle. Then the Mongols appeared, and everything changed. The rise of Genghis Khan and the Mongol conquests represent one of the most dramatic and consequential events in all of human history. Beginning in the early 13th century, the Mongol warriors under Genghis and his successors swept across Eurasia with a speed and destructiveness that seemed almost supernatural to contemporaries. They destroyed the Jin dynasty that had been pressuring the Song from the north. They swept through Central Asia, Persia, and the Caucasus. They sacked Baghdad in 1258, killing the Abbasid Caliph and effectively ending a caliphate that had been the center of Islamic civilization for 5 centuries. They invaded Poland and Hungary, crushing European armies in battle and making the courts of Western Europe tremble. Only the death of the great Khan Urgide, which required the Mongol princes to return east for the election of a successor, saved Western Europe from further invasion. But the Song dynasty survived the initial Mongol onslaught longer than almost anyone else. This is sometimes overlooked in narratives of Mongol conquest. The Song resisted for decades, from the 1230s through the 1270s, fighting a grinding, exhausting, but ultimately losing struggle against the most formidable military machine the world had yet seen. The Mongols had never fought a campaign quite like this one. They were masters of the open steppe, of rapid cavalry maneuver across vast distances. But southern China was a different kind of battlefield, dense, wet, cut through with rivers and canals, with a tropical and subtropical climate that was brutal for the northern steppe warriors. The song exploited these advantages skillfully, turning their river system into a defensive barrier and their cities into fortresses of extraordinary resilience. The siege of Xianyang stands as perhaps the most remarkable episode of this long resistance. Xianyang was a city on the Han River, a crucial strategic position controlling access to the Yangtze Valley. The Mongols besieged it in 1267, and the siege would last until 1273, nearly 6 years. For 6 years, the city held out, resisting everything the Mongols could bring against it, supplied by daring river convoys that fought their way through the Mongol blockade. When the city finally fell, it fell not through direct assault but through a combination of the Mongol acquisition of sophisticated Muslim siege engineers, who built trebuchets of a type never before seen in China, capable of throwing projectiles with a force that shattered the defenders' will, and the exhaustion of the city's resources after years of siege. The fall of Xianyang opened the path to the Yangtze, and once the Mongols crossed the Yangtze in force, the strategic situation became almost hopeless for the Song. The Mongol leader who orchestrated the final conquest of the southern Song was Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who had made himself ruler of China and founded the Yuan dynasty. Kublai was a sophisticated ruler by Mongol standards, deeply interested in Chinese culture and administration, but he was also absolutely determined to complete the conquest of China that his predecessors had begun. By the 1270s, his forces had taken the Yangtze Valley, the Song court had fled south, and one city after another was falling to the relentless Mongol advance. The Song court at this point was in a state of desperation and chaos. The Emperor Gong, only a child, had surrendered to the Mongols along with the Empress Dowager, but loyalists had refused to accept surrender. They had taken 2 younger princes, brothers of the captured emperor, and continued resistance in the name of one of them. First the younger prince Shi was proclaimed emperor, and then after his death his even younger brother Bing was enthroned. Emperor Bing was, at the time of his enthronement, 7 years old. The real power lay with 2 officials, Lu Xiufu and Zhang Shiji, who kept the resistance alive through sheer force of will and extraordinary personal courage. These 2 men deserve to be remembered. Zhang Shiji was a military commander of genuine skill, a man who had been fighting the Mongols for years and who refused to accept that the cause was lost even when almost everyone else had. Lu Xiufu was a civil official, a scholar administrator of the old Song type, deeply committed to his dynasty and his civilization. Between them, they organized the last stand of the southern Song, gathering what remained of the Song fleet and the Song court and retreating step by step southward as the Mongol armies pressed them from the north. By early 1279, the remnants of the Song court and its fleet had taken refuge near Yamen, a location on the Pearl River Delta in what is now Guangdong province. The name Yamen refers to a narrow strait formed by 2 rocky outcroppings, creating a natural defensive position. Zhang Shiji had assembled an enormous fleet here. Estimates vary, but most sources suggest somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 vessels of various sizes. He had with him perhaps 200,000 people in total, including soldiers, sailors, court officials, nobles, servants, and civilians who had fled the Mongol advance. Zhang Shiji's defensive strategy at Yamen was bold to the point of recklessness. He ordered the fleet to be lashed together in a massive floating platform, the ships chained to one another to create what was effectively a floating fortress. The Song court, including the child Emperor Bing, was placed aboard a large vessel in the center of this formation. Zhang apparently calculated that the narrow waters of the strait, combined with the sheer mass of the lashed fleet, would give the Song forces an advantage in defense. The Mongol fleet could not surround them completely, and any attacker would have to come at them through the confined waters where numbers and maneuverability might count for less than defensive position. It was a reasonable plan. It was also, ultimately, a fatal one. The Mongol commander facing Zhang Shiji was Zhang Hongfen, a Chinese general who had gone over to the Mongols. This is one of the painful ironies of the battle. The man who would destroy the last Song emperor was himself ethnically Han Chinese, a defector whose military skills and knowledge of Song tactics made him invaluable to the Yuan forces. Zhang Hongfen arrived off Yamen with a fleet variously estimated at between 500 and 800 vessels, substantially smaller than the Song fleet, but with decisive advantages in discipline, strategic flexibility, and logistical support. The initial phase of the battle was a period of probing and positioning that lasted for weeks. Zhang Hongfen first attempted to cut the Song fleet off completely, blocking the northern and southern exits from the strait. He then attempted to destroy the Song position by sending fire ships down the tide toward the lashed Song fleet, a classic tactic for attacking stationary or tethered ships. But Zhang Shiji had anticipated this. He had covered the hulls of his ships with mud and extended wooden poles outward from the sides to push burning vessels away. The fire ship attack failed, and for a time it appeared that the Song defensive position might actually hold. But then the situation began to shift. Zhang Hongfen cut the Song fleet off from its sources of fresh water and food. The men and women aboard those lashed ships began to weaken. The morale of the defenders, already strained by months of retreat and defeat, began to erode. And Zhang Hongfen was methodically preparing for a coordinated, multi-directional assault. On the morning of what most scholars calculate to be February 23 or March 19, 1279, depending on the calendar conversion used, Zhang Hongfen launched his full assault. He divided his fleet into multiple squadrons attacking from different directions simultaneously, using drums and flags to coordinate the attack. His forces moved in under cover of a morning fog, closing with the Song fleet before the defenders could properly prepare. What followed was a battle of extraordinary ferocity and chaos. The lashed Song ships, which had seemed like a fortress, now became a trap. The ships could not maneuver individually. The crews could not retreat. They could only stand and fight as Mongol forces closed from multiple directions, boarding ships and fighting hand to hand across the lashed decks. The noise must have been overwhelming: the crash of hulls, the screaming of the wounded, the battle cries of the Mongol soldiers, the desperate shouts of Song commanders trying to organize resistance amid the chaos. Zhang Shiji tried everything he could to restore order and break the encirclement. He mounted counterattacks with whatever vessels he could free from the main formation. He rallied his men with personal courage, fighting in the thick of the battle, but the position was collapsing. Ship after ship was taken. The Mongol forces were pouring onto the lashed fleet from all sides, and then came the moment that would echo through Chinese history for centuries. Lu Xiufu, the scholar official who had kept the Song resistance alive through sheer devotion to his emperor, saw that the battle was lost beyond all recovery. He took the child Emperor Bing, this 7-year-old boy who was the last legitimate sovereign of the Song dynasty, into his arms, and he walked to the edge of the ship. And he jumped into the sea, carrying the emperor with him. Both of them drowned. It is difficult to fully convey the historical and emotional weight of this moment. Lu Xiufu was not choosing death out of despair or cowardice. He was making a deliberate, calculated choice. He would not allow the last Song emperor to fall into Mongol hands to be paraded as a captive, displayed as proof of Kublai Khan's total victory over the Chinese people. Better death than that humiliation. Better the cold waters of the Pearl River Delta than a Mongol prison. It was an act of absolute loyalty, and it was the death of a dynasty. What happened next in the waters of Yamen was a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. When the soldiers and sailors of the Song fleet understood that the emperor was dead, that the cause was truly, finally, irreversibly lost, many of them chose to follow him. Accounts from the time speak of tens of thousands of people throwing themselves into the sea or being killed in the fighting. The bodies were so numerous that they choked the waters for days afterward. Historical sources, which must be treated with some caution given the tendency toward dramatic exaggeration, speak of over 100,000 dead. Modern historians generally accept that the death toll was indeed catastrophic, though precise figures are impossible to establish at this distance. Zhang Shiji himself managed to escape the immediate destruction with a small number of ships, but his escape was tragically brief. His ship was caught in a typhoon shortly afterward, and he too died, either drowned or lost at sea. With his death, the last military leader of the Southern Song resistance was gone. The Yuan dynasty was now truly and completely the master of all China. Among surviving contemporary accounts, one phrase appears that has haunted Chinese historians and intellectuals ever since. When the bodies of the drowned were washing ashore in the days after the battle, observers reported seeing the red sashes of court officials among the corpses, the distinctive insignia of the Song bureaucracy, those scholar officials who had kept the machinery of Chinese civilization running for 3 centuries. The sight of those red sashes floating in the water came to symbolize, for later generations, the drowning not just of individuals but of a civilization itself. The fall of the Southern Song dynasty at Yamen had consequences that reverberated through Chinese and world history for centuries. The most immediate consequence was the completion of Mongol rule over all of China. The Yuan dynasty that Kublai Khan had founded now governed the entire country, the first time in history that a non-Chinese dynasty had conquered and ruled all of China simultaneously. The Mongols ruled differently from previous Chinese dynasties. They maintained a strong ethnic hierarchy, with Mongols at the top, followed by various Central Asian peoples, then Northern Chinese who had lived under previous non-Chinese dynasties, and finally the Southern Chinese, the former subjects of the Song, at the bottom of the social order. This ethnic stratification created deep resentments that would simmer for the roughly century of Yuan rule. But the Mongol conquest also, paradoxically, had some positive effects from a global perspective. The Pax Mongolica, the relative peace and order that the Mongol Empire imposed across Eurasia, facilitated trade and cultural exchange on a scale that had not been possible before. The Silk Road thrived under Mongol protection in a way it had not for centuries. Ideas, technologies, and diseases moved across Eurasia with unprecedented speed. It was the increased connectivity of the Mongol period that allowed the Black Death to travel from Central Asia to Europe, killing 1/3 of the continent's population. It was also this connectivity that brought Marco Polo to China and introduced European audiences to the extraordinary civilization that had survived there, even under Mongol rule. For China itself, the Yuan dynasty proved unstable. The Mongols, who had conquered an agricultural civilization of enormous sophistication, were never fully comfortable as rulers of that civilization. They maintained their steppe traditions, their nomadic identity, their distrust of settled Chinese ways. The Yuan government was plagued by succession disputes, factional conflicts, and increasingly ineffective administration. Economic mismanagement, including catastrophic overprinting of paper currency that triggered inflation, weakened the dynasty. Natural disasters, including the change in course of the Yellow River, displaced millions of people and created conditions for rebellion. The Ming dynasty that overthrew the Mongols in 1368 emerged from precisely these conditions of popular suffering and rebellion. The Ming founder, Zhu Yuanzhang, was himself a man of humble origin who had experienced the worst of Yuan misrule. The Ming dynasty, he founded, was in many ways a deliberate attempt to restore what had been lost, to rebuild Chinese civilization on the ruins of the Mongol period and reconnect with the glories of the Song. The Ming Confucian revival, the massive literary projects like the Yongle Encyclopedia, the restoration of the civil service examination system, all of these can be understood as attempts to reach back across the Yuan interlude and reconnect with the Song tradition. But something had changed. The Ming dynasty, for all its achievements, was in certain crucial respects more cautious, more conservative, more inward-looking than the Song had been. The great maritime expeditions of Zheng He in the early 15th century showed what Chinese seafaring technology was still capable of. His treasure fleets, reaching as far as East Africa, were larger than anything European powers could have assembled at the time. But the Ming court eventually turned away from these expensive ventures, retreated behind the Great Wall, and adopted policies that progressively closed China off from the kind of dynamic commercial and intellectual exchange that had characterized the Song. The maritime outward-looking spirit of the Song dynasty never fully returned. There is a counterfactual that historians sometimes contemplate, though always with appropriate caution about what such exercises can actually tell us. What if the Song had survived? What if Zhang Shiji had found a way to escape Yamen to keep the resistance alive, to eventually reconstitute Chinese resistance against the Mongols and re-establish a Chinese dynasty? Given the dynamism of Song civilization, its commercial sophistication, its technological advancement, its maritime capability, might China have developed in ways that would have made it the dominant world civilization going into the early modern period? Might Chinese ships have reached the Americas before Columbus? Might the Industrial Revolution have begun in the Yangtze Delta rather than the English Midlands? These questions cannot be answered. And responsible historians are careful not to assert that any particular outcome was inevitable. History is not a machine that produces predictable outputs. The decisions of individual people, the randomness of weather and disease, the unpredictable consequences of technological change, all of these can redirect the course of events in ways that seem obvious only in retrospect. But the fact that these questions are worth asking tells us something important about what the Song dynasty represented. It was a civilization of sufficient vitality and sophistication that the road to modernity, whatever form modernity might have taken, ran through it. What we can say with confidence is this: the Battle of Yamen was not merely the defeat of an army or the overthrow of a government. It was the violent interruption of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The Song dynasty at its height was a place where merchants traded across oceans with paper money, where scholars studied astronomy and mathematics, where painters pursued the perfect brushstroke with the same dedication that European monks gave to illuminated manuscripts, where engineers built bridges and canals and mechanical clocks, where farmers and craftsmen fed and clothed a population of extraordinary size and density. All of this did not vanish overnight. Civilizations are not so easily destroyed. But the shock of conquest, the imposition of Mongol rule, the trauma of defeat, left marks on Chinese civilization that took generations to process. The memory of Yamen was preserved in Chinese historical writing and in local tradition, particularly in Guangdong province where the battle was fought. The site became a place of mourning and commemoration. Later generations of Chinese scholars, particularly during the Ming and Qing periods, returned again and again to the story of the battle, meditating on what it meant, what lessons it offered, what it said about loyalty and sacrifice and the fragility of civilization. The figures of Lu Xiufu and Zhang Shiji were celebrated as martyrs, as examples of the kind of absolute loyalty to dynasty and culture that Confucian ethics demanded. Their story became part of the repertoire of historical examples that educated Chinese people drew on to think about their own situations. There is particular poignancy to the figure of Lu Xiufu. He was not a soldier. He was a scholar, a man of books and documents and administrative skill, the kind of person who in other circumstances might have spent his life writing commentaries and managing government offices. But when the last moment came, he made the hardest possible choice with complete clarity of purpose. He would not betray his emperor. He would not allow his dynasty to be humiliated in defeat. He chose the only form of resistance left to him: And he jumped. The child Emperor Bing was 7 years old. He had been emperor for less than 2 years, and he had understood almost nothing of the political crisis swirling around him. He was, in the end, simply a child caught in the machinery of history and destroyed by it. The records do not tell us much about him as an individual. He is more symbol than person in the historical record. But remembering his humanity, his childhood, his complete helplessness in the face of overwhelming historical forces, is perhaps the most important act of historical imagination we can perform as we think about Yamen. Wars and battles are not abstractions. They are made of individual human beings, and the most devastating thing about Yamen was not the strategic defeat or the political consequences, but the human cost, the 100,000 people who went into that water and never came back. Let us take a moment to think about the broader context of naval warfare in the medieval world, because understanding where the Battle of Yamen sits in the history of maritime combat helps us appreciate just how extraordinary it was. The largest naval engagements in Western medieval history, Sluys in 1340, Lepanto in 1571, which technically falls in the early modern period, involved fleets of perhaps 400 to 500 ships at their largest. The Battle of Yamen, with its combined total of over 1,500 vessels, was operating at a scale that had no parallel in the Western world. The logistics alone of assembling, supplying, and coordinating a fleet of that size were staggering, and they speak to the organizational capacity of Song China, which could still field such a force even in the last desperate stages of its existence. The technology on display at Yamen also deserves closer examination. The Song fleet was not simply a collection of traditional wooden ships. It incorporated the most advanced naval technology of the medieval world. The ships were equipped with gunpowder weapons, fire bombs, fire arrows, and possibly early firearms that gave their crews a significant advantage in close quarters fighting at range. The compass navigation that Chinese sailors had pioneered allowed the fleet to operate effectively in coastal waters even in poor visibility. The watertight compartment design of the larger Song vessels made them more resilient than they might otherwise have been. Against all of this technology and experience, the Mongol fleet under Zhang Hongfen won, and the fact that they won despite these disadvantages speaks to the quality of Mongol military leadership and the ultimately unsustainable strategic position of the Song. The battle also illustrates something important about the relationship between military innovation and strategic context. Zhang Shiji's decision to lash his fleet together was tactically ingenious and strategically disastrous. By creating a floating fortress, he eliminated the one advantage that might have saved him, the ability to maneuver. A lashed fleet cannot run, cannot regroup, cannot redeploy to exploit opportunities or respond to threats. It can only fight where it is, defend what it holds, and hope that the enemy will exhaust himself against its defenses. Against a patient, well-supplied, and skillfully led opponent like Zhang Hongfen, this was a recipe for eventual defeat. The lesson that turning your greatest strength into a purely defensive asset can be a fatal mistake echoes through military history. We should also spend some time with the figure of Zhang Hongfen because he represents one of the more complex and troubling aspects of the Battle of Yamen. He was Han Chinese, born into a family that had served the Jin dynasty and then transferred its allegiance to the Mongol Yuan. He rose to high military command in the Yuan forces through genuine ability, and it was his skill as a commander that ultimately broke the Song resistance at Yamen. For later Chinese historians, he was a traitor, a man who turned his talents against his own people. But the reality was more complicated. The political world of 13th century East Asia was not organized around the kind of ethnic nationalism that later generations would project back onto it. People of many backgrounds served in the forces of the various competing powers. Zhang Hongfen was doing what successful people in his position often did, serving the power that seemed to offer the best future. This does not excuse the consequences of his actions, which included the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. But it is a reminder that history is rarely a simple story of heroes and villains, and that the people who make decisions in the heat of crisis are often doing so under constraints and pressures that are difficult to judge from the comfortable distance of centuries. The Mongol victory at Yamen raises a question that has occupied historians of China for many decades. Why did the Mongols, who had been stopped by the Song for so long, ultimately succeed in conquering the southern dynasty when so many other enemies had failed? The answers are multiple and interconnected. The Mongols were simply better organized and more militarily effective than any previous threat the Song had faced. They were willing to invest in learning new forms of warfare. They brought in Muslim siege engineers for Xianyang. They built up a substantial naval force despite having no maritime tradition. They adapted their methods to the specific challenges of fighting in southern China in ways that showed genuine military intelligence. They also benefited from the defection of numerous Han Chinese military commanders and administrators who brought their expertise to the Yuan cause. The Song, for their part, were hampered by political divisions within the court, by the chronic shortage of cavalry that made offensive operations nearly impossible, by the structural reluctance of a civilian-dominated bureaucracy to commit fully to the kind of brutal, total warfare that the Mongols practiced. The Song court during the final decades was not uniformly incompetent or cowardly. There were brilliant and dedicated officials and commanders who fought to the last. But the system they were working within had accumulated structural weaknesses over generations, and those weaknesses became fatal when the pressure reached its maximum intensity. There is also the simple factor of scale. The Mongol Empire at its height was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, covering roughly 24 million square kilometers and ruling populations from Korea to Poland. The resources available to Kublai Khan were virtually unlimited by comparison with what the Southern Song could mobilize from their diminishing territory. They could absorb defeats, rebuild destroyed fleets, call up fresh troops from across the empire, outlast any conventional military resistance that the Song could organize. Given time and sufficient commitment, the outcome may have been almost inevitable, and yet. The fact that the Song held out for more than 4 decades of serious Mongol pressure, that they made the Mongols pay enormous costs in blood and treasure for every step of the conquest, that they organized the last stand at Yamen rather than simply surrendering, all of this speaks to the resilience and the courage of the dynasty in its final years. It was not a graceful death, but it was not an ignoble one either. Let us now turn to the longer historical legacy of the Battle of Yamen, because this legacy extends beyond China and beyond the medieval period in ways that are still felt today. The Mongol conquest of the Song completed the creation of the Yuan dynasty, which in turn became part of the extraordinary Mongol Empire network that connected Eurasia as never before. This connectivity accelerated the exchange of knowledge and technology that would eventually contribute to the conditions for the European Renaissance, and much later the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. The technologies that Chinese civilization had developed, paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, all traveled westward through the networks of Mongol-facilitated trade, and would be taken up by European powers who used them to transform the world. There is a profound historical irony here. The civilization that was destroyed at Yamen had developed the technologies that would eventually enable a different civilization on the other side of the world to achieve global dominance. China invented gunpowder, which European armies used to conquer the Americas. China pioneered compass navigation, which European sailors used to sail around Africa and across the Atlantic. China developed block printing, which was a precedent for the movable type that Gutenberg used to print the Bible and accelerate the Reformation. The victors of Yamen, the Mongols, served as the unwitting conduit through which these civilizational gifts were transmitted from their place of origin to the people who would ultimately use them to reshape the world. The specific site of the battle at Yamen in Guangdong province was later commemorated with a temple and various memorial inscriptions. One of the most famous of these inscriptions, attributed to a Ming dynasty official, read simply, "Here perished the Song." It is one of the tersest and most devastating epitaphs in historical memory. 3 characters in the original Chinese, an entire civilization compressed into a phrase. The memory of Yamen became particularly charged during the later Qing dynasty, when China again found itself under the rule of a non-Han dynasty, the Manchu Qing, who had conquered Ming China in the 17th century. Chinese intellectuals living under Qing rule looked back at the Song dynasty and its fall with a mixture of grief, admiration, and self-identification. The loyalty of Lu Xiufu and Zhang Shiji became models of behavior to which Han Chinese could aspire even while living under alien rule. The story of Yamen was implicitly a story about how to maintain one's cultural and civilizational identity even in the face of military defeat and political subjugation. This political resonance continued into the 20th century. During the nationalist period of Chinese history, the Battle of Yamen was invoked as a symbol of national resistance to foreign aggression. During and after the Sino-Japanese War, when Chinese intellectuals were grappling with their nation's weakness in the face of modern military power, the Song dynasty's similar experience of being overwhelmed by a militarily superior force from the north served as a reference point for thinking about civilizational survival, national humiliation, and the will to resist. Today, the Battle of Yamen occupies a complex place in Chinese historical memory. On one hand, it is remembered as a catastrophe, a defeat, the moment when one of China's greatest dynasties was extinguished. On the other hand, the figures of Lu Xiufu and Zhang Shiji are celebrated as heroes, as examples of the loyalty and courage that Chinese culture prizes most highly. The battle is taught in Chinese schools as an important historical event, and the site has been preserved as a historical monument. There is ongoing scholarly debate about the precise details of the battle, the exact number of ships and people involved, the specific sequence of events, the precise location of the emperor's death, but the broad outlines are firmly established in both documentary sources and archaeological evidence. The comparison to Trafalgar, which we invoked at the beginning of this journey, is worth returning to now that we have a fuller picture of what Yamen involved. Both battles were decisive naval engagements that ended a dynasty's, or a power's, ambitions at sea. Both involved commanders of extraordinary skill on both sides. Both resulted in the death of figures whose courage became legendary. Nelson at Trafalgar, struck by a musket ball as he paced the quarterdeck of the Victory, died knowing that his fleet had won. Lu Xiufu at Yamen, stepping off the edge of his ship into the dark water, died knowing that his dynasty had lost. But the differences are perhaps more instructive than the similarities. Trafalgar, for all its drama, was a battle fought between professional navies of comparable size and technology, with clear strategic objectives on both sides. The total casualties were, by the standards of the Napoleonic Wars, moderate. Yamen was an apocalyptic event, a battle that encompassed not just two fleets but the entire remaining population of a civilization. The court, the officials, the nobles, the soldiers, the servants, the camp followers, all crammed into those lashed ships in the narrow strait, fighting for survival with nowhere to go. The scale of the human catastrophe at Yamen simply has no parallel in Western naval history. And this is perhaps the most important reason why we should all know more about this battle than we do. Western historical education, inevitably shaped by the priorities and experiences of Western civilization, tends to see the world's past through a lens focused primarily on Europe, the Mediterranean, and the adjacent regions that fed into what we call the Western tradition. This is understandable. People naturally begin their study of history with the traditions closest to them, but it is also ultimately impoverishing. The world has been full of great civilizations, great battles, great moments of human courage and tragedy and civilizational transformation that occur entirely outside the Western frame of reference. The Battle of Yamen is one of these moments. It deserves a place in the global historical consciousness alongside Thermopylae and Waterloo and Midway. The Southern Song dynasty at the height of its power governed one of the largest, most sophisticated and most dynamic civilizations in human history. Its people were not passive victims of historical forces they did not understand. They built extraordinary cities, wrote profound literature, developed technologies centuries ahead of their time, traded across the known world and fought for their survival with skill and courage against an enemy of unprecedented power. When that fight finally ended in the waters off Yamen, it was the end of something genuinely extraordinary, not just a political entity, but a way of organizing human life that has never quite been replicated. As we stand at the end of this long journey through the history of the Song dynasty and the Battle of Yamen, let us take a moment to simply sit with the weight of what we have learned. We began with a hook, a number, 100,000, and a challenge to understand what that number means in human terms. We have now followed the full arc of a civilization from its brilliant founding, through centuries of achievement and struggle, to its final desperate stand in a narrow strait on the edge of the South China Sea. We have met remarkable people, the brilliant scholars of the Song academies, the courageous defenders of Xianyang, the desperate loyalists who kept the last emperor alive through years of retreat, and finally Lu Xiufu, the scholar who chose death over surrender, carrying a 7-year-old boy into the sea. History, at its best, is not just a recounting of dates and battles and dynasties. It is an act of imagination, an attempt to reach across time and understand what it meant to be human in a different place in a different moment. The people who died at Yamen were not abstractions. They were parents and children, lovers and friends, scholars and soldiers, sailors and servants. They were people who woke up on the morning of that last battle with fears and hopes just like ours. They had no way of knowing that the fight they were about to enter would be their last. They had no way of knowing that they would be remembered or forgotten for centuries afterward, but we can choose to remember them. We can choose to look at this corner of the world's past that Western education has largely ignored and say, this happened and it mattered, and the human beings who lived it deserve to have their story told. That is what history is for. Not just to make us feel good about the past, not just to provide a comforting narrative of progress and triumph, but to help us see the full complexity of human experience, the courage and the cruelty, the brilliance and the folly, the extraordinary things that people are capable of both in creation and in destruction. The Battle of Yamen ended on a cold winter's day nearly 750 years ago. The ships rotted away, the bodies were reclaimed by the sea, and the narrow strait where one of history's great civilizations breathed its last returned to the quietude of coastal waters. But the story endures. It endures in Chinese historical memory, in the temple inscriptions and the poetry and the scholarly debates. It endures in the global history of technology and ideas, in the paper and the compass and the gunpowder that shaped the modern world. And now it endures here, in this telling in your memory, carried forward into whatever comes next. The Song dynasty may have perished at Yamen, But the knowledge that it existed, that it was great, that it fought with everything it had and finally fell to an enemy that could not be defeated, that knowledge belongs to all of us. And keeping it alive is perhaps the most fitting tribute we can pay to the 100,000 who went into the water and never came back. So here is the question I leave you with, and I want you to really think about it. If the Southern Song dynasty had somehow survived the Battle of Yamen, if Zhang Shiji had broken through the Mongol encirclement, if the child emperor had lived, if Chinese civilization had continued along the extraordinary trajectory it was following in the 12th and 13th centuries, do you think the history of the world would look fundamentally different today? Would China rather than Europe have been the civilization that connected the globe, colonized the Americas and built the modern world? Or are there other factors at work, geography, culture, political structure, that would have shaped history along broadly similar lines regardless of who won on that winter morning off the coast of Guangdong? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This conversation is 400 years overdue, and I want to hear what you think. If this story moved you, if it taught you something you did not know before, if it made you see the world's history in a slightly different way, then please share it with someone who you think would care about knowing it. Subscribe for more stories from the corners of history that most people never find. And remember, the past is larger than any of us can fully see. The more of it we know, the better equipped we are to understand the present and to face whatever comes next.